In this episode, we walk through threat hunting as a complete process, from the moment you form a hypothesis to the moment you can say, with intellectual honesty, what you found and how confident you are. Many beginners hear about hunting and picture it as free-form exploration, like scrolling through data until something feels strange. That kind of searching can occasionally stumble onto a real issue, but it is not reliable, and it is hard to defend because the reasoning is invisible. A real hunting process is structured, evidence-driven, and designed to produce conclusions that another person could review and agree with or challenge. The purpose is not to prove that the environment is compromised, and it is not to prove that it is clean, because both of those extremes can create bias. The purpose is to test a specific, reasonable suspicion and then clearly communicate what the evidence supports. When you can do that, hunting becomes a disciplined extension of investigation skills rather than an improvisational activity. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The process starts with a hypothesis, and the most important beginner point is that a hypothesis must be specific enough to be testable. A weak hypothesis is something like there might be malware somewhere, because that does not tell you what to look for or where to look. A stronger hypothesis focuses on a behavior, a likely pathway, or a likely target, such as the idea that an attacker could be using stolen credentials to access sensitive systems from unusual locations, or that an attacker could be moving laterally by using administrative privileges at unusual times. The hypothesis should be grounded in some reason, such as a recent change in threat activity, a business change that increased risk, or gaps discovered in earlier investigations. It also helps if the hypothesis defines what success looks like, meaning what evidence would confirm it and what evidence would contradict it. That framing prevents you from wandering, because you always know what you are trying to learn. A well-formed hypothesis turns hunting into a controlled test, which is the first step toward defensible conclusions. Once you have a hypothesis, the next step is to identify the data you would need to test it, which forces you to connect ideas to observable reality. This step is where many hunts fail, because teams assume data exists and is trustworthy when it may be missing, incomplete, or inconsistent. A disciplined approach asks where the relevant signals would appear, such as identity records, host activity traces, network connection summaries, or change records. You also consider which systems are in scope for the hypothesis, because hunting the entire environment at once can be inefficient and may produce too much noise to interpret. For beginners, it is helpful to think about what evidence would be closest to the behavior you are testing, since closer evidence is often clearer than derived or indirect alerts. You also think about time, because a hypothesis usually implies a time window, such as the last week, the last month, or the period after a specific change. When you explicitly define data sources, scope, and time window, you have a hunt plan that is more than a vague intention. The next part of the process is to create a baseline or expectation so you can interpret what you find. Baseline does not mean a perfect model of normal, but it means you need some understanding of what typical behavior looks like in the area you are hunting. If you are hunting for unusual authentication, you need some sense of normal login patterns for the relevant accounts and systems. If you are hunting for unusual process execution, you need some sense of what common processes and parent-child relationships look like for those systems. Without a baseline, you may flag normal but unfamiliar activity as suspicious, which creates false leads that waste time and reduce confidence in hunting. A baseline can be as simple as reviewing a recent time period that you believe is likely clean and comparing patterns, or it can be built from known operational schedules and roles. The key is that you explicitly acknowledge what you are using as normal, because that makes your interpretation transparent. Transparency is essential for defensible conclusions, because it shows how you separated unusual from expected. With hypothesis, data sources, scope, and baseline defined, you move into execution, which is the step of querying, filtering, and iteratively refining what you look at. Execution should be iterative, because your first view of the data is rarely perfect, and you usually need to refine your approach as you learn what the data contains. The disciplined approach is to start broad enough to capture relevant activity, then narrow based on evidence, not on convenience. You might begin by looking at all events that could reflect the behavior, then filter to the systems and scope, then narrow to the accounts or time windows that look most unusual. As you refine, you keep track of each adjustment and why you made it, because those choices influence what you can conclude later. This is also where you look for corroboration, meaning you try to confirm suspicious patterns using independent data sources rather than relying on a single signal. If one source suggests a pattern, another source should align if the behavior is real, and mismatches often reveal data quality issues or alternate explanations. This iterative, corroborating approach is what transforms raw searching into structured hunting. A critical part of execution is managing uncertainty, because hunting often produces ambiguous signals that could be benign or malicious depending on context. For example, an unusual login time might be suspicious, but it might also be an on-call administrator responding to a legitimate issue. An unusual connection might look like data movement, but it might also be a routine system update or backup. The right move is not to immediately label everything as malicious or benign, but to treat ambiguous findings as a need for additional validation. Validation can include looking for supporting behaviors that typically accompany malicious activity, such as privilege changes, unexpected access to sensitive resources, or unusual sequences of events. It can also include looking for operational explanations, such as maintenance windows or known projects that could produce unusual patterns. The key is that you document your reasoning and you seek evidence that distinguishes between explanations. When you do that, your conclusions become defensible because they reflect deliberate analysis rather than gut feeling. Another essential step in the process is deciding when a hunting lead becomes a potential incident that needs escalation. Hunting is not the same as incident response, but hunting can discover activity that requires immediate containment and investigation. The transition should be based on evidence and risk, not on excitement, because false escalation can waste resources and damage credibility. A defensible approach considers how strong the evidence is, how severe the potential impact is, and whether the suspicious behavior appears ongoing. If you have corroborated evidence that suggests active compromise or imminent harm, escalation is appropriate even if not every detail is known. If evidence is weak or can be explained by plausible benign activity, you may continue hunting or gather additional context before escalating. This decision should be recorded in the hunt record so it can be reviewed later. For beginners, it is useful to remember that defensibility comes from being able to explain why escalation was necessary or why it was not. That explanation depends on evidence quality, corroboration, and risk assessment. As you approach conclusions, the process shifts from discovery to synthesis, which means you integrate what you found into a coherent explanation tied to the original hypothesis. Synthesis is where you check whether the evidence supports, partially supports, or contradicts the hypothesis. It is also where you reconcile your findings with the timeline, because time order can confirm plausibility or reveal contradictions. A defensible conclusion does not need to be dramatic, and it can be something like the hypothesis was not supported in the observed time window, given the available data. That kind of conclusion is still valuable because it validates certain assumptions and can reveal where visibility is insufficient. If the hypothesis is supported, a defensible conclusion specifies what evidence supports it, what the likely scope is, and what uncertainties remain. It also avoids overclaiming, because overclaiming is the fastest way to make conclusions indefensible when later evidence appears. The goal is not to be absolutely certain, but to be accurately confident based on what you observed. Defensibility depends heavily on documentation, because a conclusion is only as strong as your ability to show how you reached it. A good hunt record includes the hypothesis, the time window, the scope, the data sources used, the baseline assumptions, the steps taken, and the key findings with evidence references. It also includes alternative explanations that were considered and why they were accepted or rejected, because that shows you did not ignore obvious benign possibilities. Documentation does not need to be lengthy, but it must be clear enough that another analyst could repeat the hunt and see similar results. This repeatability is a hallmark of disciplined hunting, and it is how hunting becomes part of an operational program rather than a one-time adventure. Documentation also supports learning because it reveals where the process was blocked by missing data or confusing signals. When you capture those blockers, you create a direct path for improving visibility and detection logic. Over time, this is how hunting strengthens the entire detection capability of the organization. A complete hunting process also ends with translating what you learned into improvements, because hunting is not only about finding threats, it is about reducing blind spots. If the hunt found suspicious activity, one improvement might be creating a detection rule or alert that catches similar behavior earlier next time. If the hunt found that data was missing or inconsistent, the improvement might be improving collection, retention, or normalization of key logs. If the hunt revealed that baseline understanding was weak, the improvement might be building better context, such as asset roles, ownership, and expected access patterns. These improvements are not separate from the process, because they are what makes hunting cumulative instead of repetitive. Without improvements, you will run the same hunts and face the same uncertainty repeatedly. With improvements, each hunt increases your ability to detect and analyze faster in the future. This feedback loop is what makes threat hunting a strategic activity rather than a purely tactical one. In closing, running the threat hunting process from hypothesis to defensible conclusions is about replacing intuition-driven searching with a structured, evidence-based method that produces clear outcomes. You begin with a testable hypothesis grounded in a reasonable concern, then identify the data, scope, and time window that can actually test it. You establish baseline expectations so you can interpret patterns, execute iteratively while seeking corroboration, and manage ambiguity by validating rather than jumping to labels. You decide whether to escalate based on evidence strength and risk, then synthesize findings into a conclusion that is appropriately confident and transparent about uncertainties. Finally, you document the process so it is repeatable and translate lessons into improvements so future detection becomes stronger. When you can do all of that, your conclusions are defensible because they are tethered to evidence and clear reasoning, not to guesses. That is the core of mature threat hunting, and it is a capability that supports every other part of security operations.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.